I don't know. Here.
Where's Dan?
It's just Kate. Here. Kate can take care of it.
I had 2 folders. I can't keep 2 folders straight. No wonder Jody always yelled at me. I'll grab it when we get a break.
Stein, are we ready? Yeah. We good?
These microphones.
Better to see the PowerPoint from you then.
Secretary Burgess, do we need to call this as a commission meeting to order?
Yes, we do.
Okay, well, we're going to call the meeting to order. Are there any things that we need to add to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda this morning.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to explain, for my tardiness was a little bit, I was explaining to my colleagues that I got so wet last night in the storm, it took me this long to dry out. So it was a rough night. I hope no one else, I hope you all, no one had problems getting here if you were traveling last evening. Thank you to all the participants, and for those who are traveling out of town, we appreciate you coming for an earlier start. Do we have a count approximately on how many people we have attending?
We don't have a count of how many people are here today, although I think we ordered 250 chairs and we just sent out for an extra 100.
So, point of this is that certainly our events regarding REV have broken all records. I really appreciate everyone's attention to this matter. The first collaborative meeting on May 12th and even the symposium at Albany Law School had about 275 people, which is big even by New York standards. So thank you all for all your work. I'm really looking forward to today. We're going to be hearing the reports from the working groups and the committees that have been working with us since May 12th on this event, on this initiative. You know, for me, today is really a great time. We had an opportunity, I think, all of us to review your presentations. There's so much information, and I think that the breadth and the comprehensiveness of this initiative that we're trying to undertake in New York is indicative of the information that is laid out in the various reports. Just to, be clear on this, is what we see is that the items at the collaboratives, the working groups, and there are many, many more people who have been involved in this, have been doing, is really helping drill down, discovering the key information that we need to know, trying to understand what we know today, what we need to develop, so that as we move forward with REV, we have both a comprehensive record to make our decisions and really a good path so that we're setting ourselves on the right direction with the understanding that as we transform this industry, this is going to be a journey. And we're going to take some very, very important steps, and we will continue to develop these markets as all markets are developed over time, where we start with the fundamentals and we move on. And so I see this as a huge opportunity to get many people from the industry. And I, remarked upon the fact that the individuals who have been involved in this collaboratives represent really what I would say the full gamut of folks who are engaged in the energy industry. That would include, obviously, the utilities, the energy service providers, the NGOs and other folks who have particular interests, the environmental community, folks representing consumers, folks representing vendors. And I think with all of that, with that wealth of information, it enables us to make a much better decision. I've had an opportunity to talk to other states about what we're doing in New York. There's a lot of interest, obviously, because folks are a lot across the country are looking at these issues and trying to see how to navigate through. And so they're looking at New York. So I would like to say that the Commission is sharing that responsibility with all of you, because we really do have a lot of eyes on New York, and we want to get it right, and we want to do the right things by the consumers in New York. But one of the things that I think we should all be proud of is the process we're using. A lot of folks have asked me, well, how do you do this without litigation? And I said, and I keep responding, I can't imagine doing this in a process that was around litigation as opposed to issue development. Because as a result, because what we're getting is the insights of a lot of folks, and one of the reasons the Commission is interested in having these technical conferences is that we want to hear directly around what the issues are, and we want to have the collaboratives because we believe through the collaborative discussions we have a much richer ability to develop the facts and then a deeper understanding, of course, of then what's the right path forward is how do we proceed to make sure, again, that the interests of New Yorkers are going to be best served. So for that, I really appreciate this. I know that there's a huge amount of meetings going on. A lot of facts have to be discovered. It's very difficult sometimes because we're all used to being advocates to think about how to do this as a way as factual development as opposed to advocacy for a position. And I think from everything I have, I know there are some bumps, but there are always going to be bumps. But in general, I think it's gone extremely well, and I think the discussion today will prove that out. I also want to, again, express my appreciation, I think I could say this for all the commissioners, for RMI and for RAP for the additional hands that you're providing to us as the staff is navigating this, and again, of course, to staff who I know are doing a lot of other things besides REV for all the extra efforts. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and I hope that this is a discussion. We're going to be able to hear presentations, ask questions. I know there are other folks who are part of the co-conveners of the parties in the room that are also available if we have particular questions. And to me, this is really important part of our journey. And as the commissioners, and I know we all learn when we hear each other's questions. And so that's an important part of why we wanted to do this in this very open and transparent way, which is the way we like to run this commission. So with that, let me turn it over to Judge Stein. And both Judge Stein and Secretary Burgess are here to keep us all on task, and I appreciate that as well.
Thank you very much. So first, our objective today is to put before you the results of an extensive fact-finding project, as the chair was explaining. And this technical conference and the filing yesterday by the 4 working groups of their full reports, which are now available on the Commission website, these mark the end of this particular collaborative process. Commissioners, the panelists are here to answer your questions and engage in a conversation with you. And this is a conversation that they've been having with each other since mid-May. With that in mind, we'd like to open the floor for question and discussion after each panelist speaks. And we have plenty of time set aside for both for the presentations and the discussion. Kate and I will be keeping time to ensure that we both cover the prepared material and have ample time for a robust conversation, both with the presenters, and we also have a resource table, which is, from where I'm sitting, barely visible at the other end of the room. And those will be the people who are co-conveners of the working group, who are not giving a presentation, but who are also experts and represent, parties that have been participating in the effort, and they'll be available for your questions as well. Second, I want to just call your attention to the scale of participation in this data gathering process. Early this morning, I was discussing this with someone who's been an active participant in one of the groups, and I told him that I had counted 612 participants in the 4 working groups. Now, some of that is some double counting, because believe it or not, there are people who participated in more than one group. But he said, it tells you something, doesn't it? And I think that it does. These groups and committees met at least weekly, sometimes more. The meetings I attended were at least 3 hours long, and they did this over a 9-week period, beginning on May 12th. They also invested many additional hours both crafting questions to go out to the members of the working groups and responding to those questions, putting things in writing, all of which will be available on the Commission website and will be part of the record of this proceeding. So I've calculated this number of participants, this many meetings at 3 hours apiece over 9 weeks, and I came up with my own metric, which I am submitting for the record in this proceeding of 6,524 person meeting hours have contributed to the work here today, the product today, and to the filed reports. So obviously this represents a tidal wave of interest and concern about the issues under consideration, but it also was marked by an extremely collegial and constructive spirit, even though the interests at stake, the issues at stake are of tremendous importance for the participants, and many of them, maybe most of them, maybe all of them, have a lot on the table in terms of the outcome of this case. Third, just to say a word more about the working group process. Each of these working groups was led by a group of co-conveners, which included staff and participants from each of the constituencies that the chair was mentioning earlier, each of these sectors, as well as government, academia, and many other experts who brought their wisdom and creativity to bear on this project. So the presenters you'll be speaking with today include many of these co-conveners, and also some co-conveners will be available, as I said, at the resource table to answer questions. They'll be introduced by the staff in each panel, and your briefing book includes brief biographies of all of the presenters. So these working groups were charged with data gathering in 4 general areas. I'm not going to belabor it, it's on the agenda, but platform technologies, market and platform issues, customer engagement, and microgrids. I could pick out 2 themes that, in my view, emerge from this process, broad themes. And the first is a theme of potential, the enormous potential for harnessing the REV vision, these new approaches, new technologies, for a more engaged and active customer base, and for integrating new technologies and clean technologies into our energy system. And second, the theme of barriers, the obstacles that are present in our current system that need to be addressed or analyzed in order to move forward with the vision. So that said, these groups had the charge of data gathering, not of reaching consensus or agreement on these specific issues. The issue agenda was too broad and the time period was too short to try to reach agreement or consensus in these groups. And you'll see the tension and the areas of agreement and disagreement in the presentations. And commissioners, please, feel free to ask the panelists, did everybody agree on this? How did it work out? How was this controversial? That's part of what went into the process. And so you're seeing kind of a raw data package rather than a set of recommendations for action today. And in that spirit, the people presenting today are not representing their own organizations. They're speaking on behalf of the working group as a whole. And all of the presentations went through a very rigorous process of review by their own working groups and have come out as, let's say, representing the tenor of the working group as a whole. Fourth, I just want to put today's events in the context, a broader context of the arc of the REV proceeding as a whole, and just mention what's coming next, just so that you can place today in that context. So today, it concludes the collaborative data gathering stage of track 1, which concerns market, platform, and customer engagement issues. On Tuesday, July 8th, the 4 groups filed the full reports of their work, which are voluminous and include many attachments of the presentations, the data, the participants. They're very full reports. And in your briefing books, you have the executive summaries of each report at your fingertips today. those reports highlight the key findings of each group, the summaries. So the REV proceeding is now going to move on to the key policy issues in Track 1. The data gathering effort was not concerned with issues of policy, although of course those overlap. But on July 18th, parties will be filing responses to a series of policy questions that were posed by the staff on issues such as the identity of the distributed service provider platform, utility ownership of distributed energy resources, the benefit cost framework, and the integration of climate change objectives, to just name a few. From the data gathered and the responses to the policy questions and numerous other resources that staff has drawn on, staff will create a straw proposal which will be issued on August 22nd, which for the first time will put forward concrete recommendations for your consideration. Parties will, of course, file comments on the straw proposal by September 22nd, and we expect that there'll be a further discussion before you similar to this, although about the policy issues, so it'll be probably in a somewhat different format, sometime in the fall, although the date hasn't been set yet, and the anticipation that was contained in the order instituting this proceeding was a commission decision on these matters before the end of the year. As to Track 2, which concerns regulatory and rate-making matters, parties will also be responding to comprehensive staff questions on those issues on July 18th, and a schedule for discussion of those issues for staff proposals and preliminary sessions such as this before you will be set shortly, with a commission decision anticipated in the first quarter of next year. Are there any questions for me on any of this or clarifications before we jump in?
No, thank you. I'm
Okay.
good. Everybody? Fine. We're good. Thank you.
Okay, so let me present our first panel on platform technology, which is convened and will be chaired by Mike Reeder.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Michael Reeder, and I'm the staff co-convener for Working Group 2, Platform Technology. Presenting today for the working group to my immediate right is Tom Mibnoff from Consolidated Edison, Forrest Small from Bridge Energy Group, David Lovelady from Siemens PTI, John DeLoya from staff, and Peggy Neville from staff. Also with us today are two co-conveners, Brian Horton from Consolidated Edison and Jim Gallagher from the New York State Smart Grid Consortium. In addition to Jim, Brian, and myself as co-conveners, Peggy and David were the co-conveners for this working group. And I want to say it's our pleasure for being here to be able to present the findings of Working Group 2, Platform Technology. I will give an overview of the working group, highlighting its objectives, structure, and the process we employed. I will also briefly summarize our key findings to keep those in mind as we go through our presentations. After I speak, members of the subgroups will report on their subgroups' objectives, actions, and key findings. Peggy will then tie everything that you've heard back together. Before I continue, I would like to thank the working group members, especially the co-conveners, the subgroup leads, and our staff team for the tireless efforts that they have made to make this report possible in such a very limited time frame. As you will see, the Platform Technology Working Group has developed a great deal of pertinent information, though only a small portion of our work will be highlighted here today. The complete report, as Eleanor mentioned, was filed on July 8th, and it contains much more information and will be used to inform staff's straw proposal, again, which is scheduled to be filed on August 22nd. Staff's April 24 REV report put forth a vision in which a distributed system platform provider, or DSPP, will actively manage and coordinate distributed energy resources. The DSPP will also provide a market in which customers are able to optimize their priorities while providing and being compensated for system benefits. The objective of this working group was to identify the infrastructure and technology needed to create and enable that flexible platform. As a starting point, the working group developed these guiding principles, which are on the slide, which tie directly to the Commission's policy objectives to guide us in our discussions and our work efforts. Our scope was specifically focused on the technologies needed to create the platform. We did not focus on end-use technologies, and we purposefully remained agnostic to who the DSPP is, whether it be the utility or a third party. After developing our guiding principles, we then structured our working group into 4 subgroups. The first, which will be presented by Tom Mimnaugh, level set the working group by putting us all on the same page as to the visibility and capabilities of the current distribution systems, and more importantly, inform the working group of utility projects that are underway, testing new technologies that may support the DSPP of the future. The platform functionality subgroup, being presented by Forrest Small, turned the DSPP concept into a working definition to give it structure. It then defined its potential scope and roles, again based on Commission's policy objectives, to allow the subgroup to then identify high-level functional requirements. The standards and protocol subgroup, being presented by David Lovelady, identified the standards, protocols, and system architecture requirements that should be considered in the creation of the DSPP to ensure commonality among service territories and to support the wide-scale integration of various forms of distributed energy resources. John Deloya of staff will then present on behalf of the platform technology subgroup how they use the high-level functional and system architecture requirements to begin identifying and mapping currently available technologies to the DSPP functions. This slide is intended to give you a visual representation of the working group's process and how each subgroup tied in and fed off the other. We began with the Commission's policy objectives to identify the needed DSPP platform functionality. We then identified the technology needed to enable that functionality. At the same time, we evaluated the technology's maturity and readiness while maintaining a level of commonality and interoperability. This process led us to our current key findings. However, as we move forward and as the DSPP evolves over time, we will need to tie our findings back to the policy goals to ensure we continue down the right path. Now, to summarize the working group's key findings and not to steal too much thunder from my other speakers, I will quickly hit the highlights from our working group. The utilities have been planning and deploying technologies that will improve system visibility, enhance control, and support analytics and vision for the DSPP. New York can and should build on advancements in grid technology and advancements that support distributed energy resources that are being made here and around the world. This is our opportunity to align ongoing activity with the Commission's larger vision for New York. In doing so, we must maintain a clear line of sight from policy goals to functionality to technology investments, because the DSPP will evolve over time. Well-defined standards and protocols exist that will support the DSPP, and their use will ensure commonality and consistency across service territories. We found that the data, security, and integration complexity of a DSPP requires the rigor of a structured architecture. We identified that enabling technologies do exist in various stages of maturity. However, an off-the-shelf comprehensive platform system does not. Finally, we found that the common approach is needed to assess evolving technologies to assure interoperability and consistency throughout New York and to support DSPPs that are flexible and scalable. With that, hopefully a very brief introduction, I would like to turn it over to Tom Mimnaugh of Con Edison to present for the existing utility distribution systems and capabilities subgroup. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and appreciate in particular yours and Peggy's, I know, work in keeping us going on this, as well as John's. I know that you guys have put in lots and lots of hours on this, so thank you. Any questions? Good. Tom?
Before we begin, we neglected to say what the lighting system is over here, just to keep our speakers on track. Just so you know, when you see this yellow flashing light, all the speakers have been apprised the amount of time that they have. When you see the yellow flashing light, you have a minute left. When you see the red light, it means your time is up. So we ask you just to kind of keep on track, just because we do have a lot of information to cover today, and we want to make sure that all the speakers have time to speak. So when you see the red light, if you can begin to wrap up, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have one question.
Okay, go ahead.
Was there any significant disagreement with the overall concept that the DSPP platform to integrate all of these functions is a good idea for the future?
I think the working group at large is excited about the future, and they see this as an opportunity. And it has to be done in a manner that makes sense, is cost-effective, and benefits are associated with it. So there was no major disagreement that there's a potential benefits out there in moving forward with this. That as far as the technology piece, it's not there now, but the different pieces are, so this has to be packaged together, and it'll evolve over time.
Welcome,
Okay.
Tom.
Hey, thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Good morning, Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. I was asked to combine the utility information that was presented as part of the working group. When the working group started, the participants asked for level setting. You know, what do we have today in our platforms, and what do you think is being done that is tied to the REV goals, and to what extent is it set to move forward? So we took that as a challenge, and we spent a one-day webinar for the working group to discuss a lot of detail. The detail is going to be summarized this morning for you. So I'm representing the NYSEG and RGE operating companies of Iberdrola, National Grid, Central Hudson, and Con Edison. So what we laid out was the fact that the existing platform technology is tied to predominantly the distribution system, all stem from asset management. The concept that we all have databases that define our assets. We try to tie them to geographic locations, and they are currently tied to our customer information systems. Where are our customers? What loads do they have? What needs do they have? And how do we pull that information together to be used in system planning? So that's predominantly thinking about our engineering workforce and the load flow analysis that have to take place so that we can effectively design the system. In addition to that, feeding into operating systems about what's happening in the system. And our control centers have to have a level of visibility, and to the extent that we have systems in the street today, our control centers have that capability. Certainly will need to be expanded as we look forward. We all have energy management systems that tie into our transmission grids, and so system planning emanates from that. I think the key element on the very high level takeout of that for the existing systems is that the technologies have evolved over time. We have some newer technologies that have some of the most recent protocols and architecture. We also have legacy systems that have to evolve to combine. Most of the systems that we have integrated, they've all grown up in separate environments. Different companies providing information to utilities and different platforms, and we provided interfaces between them to gain value. And as we move forward, we understand that that integration is critical, and my colleagues on the panel will be talking a lot about that criticality as we move forward. Central Hudson first talked to the group about what are the goals that are tied to the platform technologies in REV, and what are some of the strategic components that are tied to those goals. Certainly our distribution management system play into that. And the concept of having a strong information system that ties the assets and the real-time status is critical to improving grid efficiency. Definitely the existing utilization of assets are tied into that. If you don't have the visibility and you don't understand the health of your system, you certainly can't get better utilization out of those assets. We are all working currently and see the strategic components of devices and sensors on our system as critical to understanding what's going on, not just at our substations and at transmission substations, but in the street, at transformers that are within a couple of 100 foot of a customer, so that we can better understand the system components. And that ties to both resiliency and the ability to understand what's happening locally so you can get better penetration of DER. The component here we need to talk about is the communication system, and you're going to hear that combined throughout this discussion, that the existing systems, while they do provide us value, need to be taken forward and provide more value in the local distribution knowledge. NYSEG and RGE laid out a vision for what they thought was a direction the utilities were currently taking. The intent here was to say we are already thinking about things that tie into the REV process. And to the extent that the panel and the subgroups were looking at the details of the functionality and technology, we wanted to show the vision that we thought was already in place. So they laid out a process for an integrated control system. It has to be integrated. It can't be piecemeal. There has to be an alignment of global standards and practices, and we should be learning from the rest of the world about what are the best practices of how systems can combine and integrate. The components of the integration are evolving. SAP is an example, and their vision of resource planning, that it has to be on a new platform, an evolving platform. So all of the utilities have seen this as something that we have to move to. We have to tie in our geographic information. Some of our systems are digital mapping, but they may not have the full geographic information components. We have to move to that. The compliance is a requirement, whether it's at FERC and NERC, or whether it's compliance at the distribution level. The overall objective here is, what's the platform that we're building, and how do we accommodate some of the distributed generation that we want to add? And the alignment is clear. If you don't lay out these processes, the adding of DER to the process is difficult. You need to understand what's happening locally. The knowledge base and tools have to be there for customers also, so that they can leverage the knowledge that's happening. Central Hudson talked a little bit more detail about what they saw as their vision. And the distribution management system with a centralized automation was a key component. How do I take my mapping data? How do I take my geographic data and make sure that my outage management system understands it, so that real time, if a customer is out of service, that we know they're out and we can communicate that. That's an evolutionary process. Most outage management systems were born of an individual system, and we had to figure out how to tie it to other processes. The infrastructure upgrades are going to be part of that, whether it's intelligent devices such as switches on poles, that we understand power flow, we understand open and closed status, we understand fault analysis, or whether it's the ability to have tie points so that we can provide added resiliency. Many of these components have been done for quite some time in the state, and we'll just be looking to take it forward. We have to have better load flow analysis. Most of the power flow analysis products that have existed in the world, quite frankly, have considered radial type processes and not power flow from multiple points on the distribution system. So we think the evolutionary process for the load flow analysis tools are going to have to change. We are very interested and have been interested in voltage optimization. It'll become more critical when we have more generating assets and DER in the local distribution grid. Collectively, the process is, if we have a DER availability in the local pocket, the utilities believe there is an opportunity to defer some of the potential larger infrastructure transmission and capital expenditures that we have planned in the 5, 10 to 15, 20-year window. And to the extent that we can leverage those assets and understand the local system, we'll be able to provide those solutions rather than a central upgrade. National Grid provided quite a bit of information about some of the existing projects that they have. The working group asked us not to just focus on what we had going on in New York, but to the extent possible, if we had information from other states, let's leverage that and understand what's going on. National Grid talked about a project that they have going on in Worcester, Massachusetts. And that's a smart area, town. And what they're looking at is AMI, smart meters located for customers, solid communication system being built out in that local pocket, the information from their localized substation and feeders. They're putting sensors and new smart device switches out on their circuits so that they can understand power flows and voltage and optimization. What's important in the process is they're tying a lot of customer knowledge base into it. They have an extensive program. They have a local support office that has some of the tools, and customers can come in and learn about what's being attempted. They're going to look at different customer programs. They have 4 opportunities. for different programs there, and they're going to be able to look at time of use concerns during the day, and when are you using power, and what is the most efficient use of it based upon a rate that I'm on. So that's a learning process, and the expectation is that we will all learn from that as we move forward. They're also working on an anti-islanding protection scheme in Potsdam, and what that is, they've got multiple synchronous and induction generators in a localized area on one circuit. And when you do that, you've got to be concerned about what happens when that circuit goes out of power as to whether or not those generators are in fact backfeeding other customers. And there are protection schemes, and some of the folks on the panel will talk a little bit more about that. That's a critical element that we understand the proper isolation happens when it's supposed to. And so what they're doing is using power line carrier, that is communication over the power lines to transfer signals when something happens and opens that something else should open. Very simple view of it, but they've got a demonstration project they expect to complete by the end of this year. They're also working on a project that's currently in a planning mode, which involves microgrids in Potsdam area, and they've got multiple partners in it, Clarkson University, bank, hotel, critical infrastructure for the state and the area that are part of that. And they're going to build an underground environment. They have a lot of overhead exposure to storm events, the ice or heavy snow. And the concern is, what can they do in the event that they have that? What kind of microgrid could be in place? So they're actually planning it out. They're working with GE, and they're going to put a lot of technical information into what controllers might be necessary to make that a viable environment and cost-effective. And the intent is to learn from that. And that ties into many other agendas that are playing out in the state and with NYSERDA. NYSERDA PON is definitely part of that process. Key here is these play right into the objectives of what we're looking at in REV. We're important to understand the cost-benefit analysis, the customer response and the integration associated with that, and the integration of DER and how it can be done in a favorable manner. The other key elements are, these are going to help the knowledge-based tools that come out of the process. As it is now, the microgrid process and knowledge base of it is not well known. And we need to make it a simpler process so that folks understand what's happening and that they can leverage that going forward. Con Edison also laid out some information on demonstration projects. We laid out a process on distributed energy resource management system where we had DOE money and partnered with several entities, Siemens, TIPCO, Veridity, Innoventive, and Verizon. And we wanted to show how we could integrate those assets in with our control center functionality. What's the real-time knowledge about what's happening, and how are we in fact working it into our power flow programs? Real time. So if an event happens, if I need to utilize those assets, I can signal them and I can get them to play in and deload the local grid. So that was the benefit that was trying to be achieved there. In addition, Con Edison is working on a demand response management system. And the intent there is to make sure that we have proper communications and understanding of the assets that are in place, the customers, and the payment schemes and the verification of their utilization when it's done, when it's asked for, so that we can verify it and we can make timely payments. That project is expected to end by the end of the year. So both of these combined projects are, quite frankly, very much tied into the penetration of DER and the tie to the utility control center systems. So what we also, this is just a drawing showing that there are secure protocols as part of this process. The internet protocols are critical here, and that was what we were testing so that we could show that we can communicate with devices throughout the system. In our key findings and summary for the utilities, we've been working, as I explained, on many processes already. We've deployed technologies that can improve the visibility in our system. We've enhanced control schemes, and we have a vision of how we can take those systems and move them forward to create an objective that REV is looking for. We have advancements, and the advanced grid and technology will support DER. But we see it as an opportunity. And so we look forward to the technology solutions as well as tying into customer needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Audrey, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it okay? It's a question I'm not really looking for an answer yet, but I just want to listen during the presentations. One of the frustrations of the demand response community and any distributed resource community has been that each utility has a different set of rules, a different set of tariffs, a different set of requirements, often a different size limit, et cetera. And as they move from one service territory to another, it's like having to reinvent everything all over again. On the other hand, interconnecting in the middle of Queens and interconnecting in Lowville, New York at the end of a line can be quite different requirements that are necessary. And I'm just curious, as you talk about the platform, the balance between consistency and yet flexibility to understand that Central Hudson's not exactly like Con Ed in many of its networks. So just something I'd like to learn more about as we go along here, as we try to think of a platform, and is it one platform or is it 1 and 1A and 1B and 1C? Mike?
I think you'll hear that throughout the course of this presentation, how we're looking for commonality among the service territories, and the uses of standards and protocols will really get us to that level. So that was definitely a focus of our working group in order to get that playing field somewhat as much uniform as we could across the state.
That's good. Thank you. I know that I think that's an important point, because what we would like ideally is that customers or vendors or participants throughout the state, that they can go from one DSPP to another and they don't have to rewrite their own systems in order to react to what the utility would have. So I think issues of interoperability and consistency will be really important for us to make the market effective. I had a couple of questions, and then I imagine others do too. One is, Tom, and again, if you need to defer, one of the problems of going first is you might get questions that you wish somebody else got, but so you can feel free to defer if you need to. But one is as you went through the systems, and was there any discussion in your group about what would be the consistent building blocks? I mean, if you're saying that we can't go to a big bang on day one, what would you say would be some of the foundational elements that it seemed like everybody agreed to would be essential if we're going to put this in place? Or was there agreement, I should say?
I can certainly talk to that. I think one of the things that we did identify is the fact that this was going to be an evolution, and there were going to be phases of advancement, whether they're technology or customer-based tools. I do think that we had common agreement on a couple of key functions. Number one is that we saw an advanced distribution management system as key. Our systems are at different positions right now. We had to get to a somewhat common platform on an advanced distribution tool environment. It doesn't have to be the same tool, but it has to have the level of functionality that can do the load flow analysis that I spoke about as new as you include more DER in the system. We also agreed that while we can do pockets and advance our communication system, the core communication system is critical to this. We don't have as much communication to all areas of our distribution systems, and it will be different tools that will be used in different areas. Certainly a different communication system is going to play out in Lower Manhattan than a communication system that's going to play out in the upstate. But we do think that the latency of that communication system for some of the really rigorous grid automation tools and the fast action requirements of some of the resiliency requirements of a microgrid are going to require that. So two foundational items right away, ADMS and the communication system. We also thought that voltage VAR optimization might play into this. Certainly the grid efficiency element is going to play heavily there, and how that ties into DER. So I think that was foundational. There wasn't a full agreement on whether AMI would be foundational, an automated metering environment. It might be integrated, maybe partial. So that was, I think, part of the foundation.
And in your report, do you detail what's in an ADMS? What kind of functionality? I mean, one is, you had mentioned, would be situational awareness. And then the ability to do load flow analysis, would those two, would you say, would be the key?
The functional technology group has a lot of detail
Okay.
on that as
Then
we
we'll
move forward.
Let them go forward. The other thing that, I'm particularly concerned about, and maybe I'd be interested if your group talked about, we've gotten a lot of information in industry about the duck issue in California, the issues in Germany with respect to integration of wind. Was there discussion about the need to, as you build out the system, around the ability to be flexible but also to be responsive in the millisecond so that, we don't run into issues around system stability, voltage stability? Was that a key component?
Yeah, I don't know that we mentioned it as the duck component, but we did absolutely talk about it from a standpoint of response, the ability to ramp up. Solar was talked about from that perspective, and I think the committee is going to be talking a lot about the different elements of the communication system and the timeliness and the latency requirements that are part of that.
And then I have one last question. It strikes me, and I'd be interested if there, that one of the things we should be thinking about and looking at these early experiences is that on a personnel basis, the potential value of having some demonstration projects so that people in the control room can actually get real-time experience before we move to scale. Was there, I guess my concern is that every time you have an experience, you learn from it and you can build from there. I would hope that we could see, and maybe this is what you've identified, is there some things we can do early on as we scale out the system that we can learn by doing? Would that be fair from some of the demonstrations?
Yeah, so the ADMS system would also provide better tools in the control center and visibility, one-line drawings, showing real-time status so that an operator who gets alarming can understand that there's a constraint reached. Or the Con Edison demonstration project is a good example. We actually tied into our existing control center platform so that the operator would have clear visibility into the actual generator output in a localized pocket and understand whether or not they could exercise control or request control by the customer. So part of that was to show the operators what the tools might evolve to as we add more generation and load management in the system.
I have one last question. When you talk about visibility, you're not just so, because everyone thinks that we're talking about visibility of someone in a control room in Con Ed or National Grid or Iberdrola watching whether someone's refrigerator is on or off. What level of visibility are we really talking about?
So the level of visibility that we've laid out is the fact that we can see our assets. So we can see feeders in a one-line drawing. We can see how much power flow is going through them. And we see one-point node on that visual system that says, what is the power flow and the availability at the customer site? So we are not looking down to that level, at least at this point. And to the extent that it's necessary, we're not sure that it is necessary to do that. As long as we understand that we can ask for a reduction, and this is the available reduction that is at that site, and that it can be requested and triggered through the control center scheme, we feel at this point that's a good start.
So you don't really care how they achieve it, it's just that it's achieved.
That it's achieved in a manner in which it can balance the system and keep the reliability and resiliency that we expect.
Okay. Thanks. Any other further questions? I feel like I'm revealing my inner geek, but okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Forrest.
Thank you, Chair. Our next speaker is Forrest Small from Bridge Energy Group. He is representing the platform functionality subgroup.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Thanks for the opportunity to address you today. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about functionality. And if you think about the process that Mike laid out in the beginning, functionality is really the way that you go from your strategic objectives or your policy outcomes to the technologies that we'll actually end up deploying. When we began this process, we wanted to really build a framework and follow that through to create a good line of sight, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Essentially, we wanted to figure out what the DSPP is, what it does, and how it fits. And we would begin that process and then go into functionality from there. So if you look at this definition, it's our working definition of the DSPP. You'll see two things in it. One is the DSPP is an entity that actually operates an intelligent network platform. That's the grid part. But the other thing the DSPP does is it really fosters the market by enabling all of the information and the products and services that customers and other third parties will want to work with. There's three primary areas that the DSPP is working in. In the market operations area, this is about lots of information for customers and suppliers so that they can create a diverse set of products and services with that. We also want to make sure that there's a high degree of transparency in the information, that it's really flexible, and that it's very efficient. We don't want to create a layer on here that's inefficient and creates a lot of cost, but we want it to be a very enabling and facilitating type of thing. Second area is grid operations. First and foremost, we have to maintain a secure, reliable, and resilient grid. Goes without saying. But the second piece is, given all of the new products and services and distributed resources that we envision, we know that it has to be a lot more flexible and dynamic. And I think this gets to the point that you made before about the timing. Again, though, we got to make sure that it's economical and energy efficient as we do it. The third area that the DSPP plays is in integrated planning. And as we'll see in slides that follow, this is how it fits within the new ecosystem. It's got to be able to integrate its planning both with what's happening on the distribution system with customers and suppliers, but also tie that into what goes on at the New York ISO. This diagram was built to help us understand how the DSPP fits in the ecosystem. It's not intended to describe how everything works, but it's really intended to try to draw some lines so we can see the differences. There's two dimensions here. One is market operations and the second one is grid operations. And you'll notice that there are three general groups of stakeholders here. We've got the New York ISO on the left, we've got the DSPP in the middle, and we've got the thing that we're calling customers, and this is where the third-party providers would also be. But what you'll notice in the market operations is essentially the New York ISO retains a wholesale point of view. Those types of products and services we envision as being the same as they are today. The difference is that the DSPP plugs into that and is able to do some aggregation up into that market. What the DSPP focuses on is what we would describe as more of a retail market, focused on the distribution system with those customers and third-party providers that are playing at that level. And then finally, we envision some customers wanting to directly access the DSPP, perhaps work with products and services that the DSPP provides itself, but we also envision a lot of third-party activity using the DSPP as an enabler so that they can do their transactions in that way. On the grid operations side, we're looking at the ISO continuing to take a wide area view, bulk transmission operations, 115 kV and above, central station generation. The DSPP, by contrast, is taking a more regional or local view, focused primarily on the distribution system, that part of the system below 115 kV. And also, from a generation point of view, paying close attention to what's going on with DER and being able to coordinate and manage it. The customers of the third parties are looking with a premise view on that side of the meter, if you will. It could be microgrids, it could be DER. They would be responsible for the operation of those systems. The last piece that we talked about was the integrated planning piece. And again, on the left-hand side of this figure, you see the assets in orange that the DSPP really focuses on. Substations, primary distribution, secondary distribution, down to the meter. Above and below that is where the New York ISO would continue to focus, and then customers and the service providers would focus. Draw your attention to what's happening in the planning diagram on the right. What we're showing here is that there's a lot of new information that needs to come in to the DSPP so it can do its planning. I think for a long time utilities have coordinated very well with the ISO, but what's new here is that on the customer and service provider side, there's lots of new information that's flowing up in here. And the DSPP is responsible for taking all of that information, doing supply and demand planning on the distribution system, accounting for DER, demand response, energy efficiency, those sorts of things, planning their upgrades, looking for new solutions from that space, and also managing the maintenance and operations of the network. So with all of that backdrop, we wanted to look at the functionality that's necessary to achieve all of that outcome. There's a long list of functions here. We group them into three main categories. The grid things are the functions that really focus on the distribution system itself. You'll probably recognize some things here. Tom talked about voltage and bar optimization. We definitely need to be looking at what's happening on the load side. We need to be looking at power flow in the network. We need to be able to understand dynamic ratings for equipment. All of that is grid functionality. In the middle, these are things that we see as necessary from the DSPP's point of view for how it interacts with customers and DER and microgrids. So just to be clear, these are not things that we're trying to say are functions of a microgrid. That would be a decision that the microgrid owner would make. These are things that the DSPP wants to know about the microgrid or wants to know about the DER. Things like being able to manage power coming out of DER or microgrid, power factor, islanding, those kinds of things. Again, it's really a coordination function we're talking about. And finally, on the market side, it's a lot about facilitating the transfer of information to customers and third parties. It's a lot about the basics of signing up participants and registering them and doing billing and making payments and facilitating trading. Once we went through this whole process, we wanted to close the loop and go back and make sure that, in fact, the DSPP and the functionality that we described actually ties back to the policy objectives. And what we found is that it does, because if you think about the flexibility, the information, the energy efficiency, the integration of DER, all of that capability allows you to achieve the policy objectives that were laid out in the REV paper. So the big takeaways for this part of the group were creating this framework and establishing a very clear line of sight between the policy goals and the technology was extremely useful, and it helped us stay lined up as we went through the process. The other thing we want to recognize, though, is all of the functionality that we've described and the scope and roles that we've envisioned take more of an end state view on what the DSPP will eventually become, and we need to recognize that there's an evolution toward that, and we need to do that in a way that really creates the DSPP at the pace of value for the marketplace and the customers. Thank you.
Thank you. Question?
Can we go back to slide 21, page 21, the table? That one, yes, thank you. If you replace DSPP with local distribution utilities, can you tell me what's different than what exists today? I see some of those boxes that I believe would be the same and some that would be different. Can you kind of just highlight how you view what's new here as compared to what we're doing today?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are, I mean, from a scope and roles point of view, we can answer that question, and certainly from a functionality point of view, we can. But with regard to the scope and roles, the DSPP focuses on distribution, so in that way, it's probably not a lot different than a utility.
I mean, in the grid operations, it seems that's exactly what happens today.
I think that's true, and certainly from a functionality point of view, we've added a whole lot of situational awareness. There's probably quite a degree of automation that's taking place, and the speed of transactions is going to be faster, for sure. With regard to the market, I think there's a whole new recognition of the different kinds of products and services that the DSPP would facilitate and enable that the distribution utility may or may not do today.
So that's really where the newness is in the market operations.
I think the market is probably the most different of all of this, and then the degree of functionality in grid operations is I think, pretty significant.
And customers, I assume, is a much more interactive relationship with the DSPP than probably exists in most cases today?
I would envision a high degree of interaction, and then it also facilitates the interaction between third parties and customers, too.
Anything else? further questions? I have a question, I think. When you're talking about this functionality, and this is maybe a question for others too, can you envision a situation where the market operations could be segregated from the grid operations? Are we talking about this the same way we talk about it on the transmission side?
I think it depends on what you intend to do between the operations and the market. So I think one of the really important things that I recognized as we went through this process is there's an opportunity for a lot of efficiency here. And certainly to the extent that markets are tied tightly to operations, you can gain a lot of asset utilization efficiency, a lot of energy efficiency, and so we'd want to be careful we don't add a lot of layering in there to make that inefficient. But in terms of the basic operations, I think I would envision one, there's a certain kind of job you do for market operations, there's a certain kind of job you do for grid operations, but you want to be sharing that information.
Thank you. Good, thanks.
Thank you, Forrest. Our next speaker is David Lovelady from Siemens PTI. He's also a co-convener of the working group, and he led the Standards and Protocols subgroup. David?
Mike?
Yeah, he's one of these.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. I'm excited to give you this presentation today. So before we start the presentation, I would like to highlight that I will be referring to standards and protocols as SP, mostly to save wearing my tongue out. So the objectives for this presentation are to identify relevant SP, provide some key considerations, and demonstrate the relevance and importance of a DSPP architecture. Firstly, a few definitions. Interoperability is the ability of diverse systems and their components to work together. The Holy Grail is plug and play. Protocol is a series of prescribed steps to be taken, usually in order to allow for the coordinated action of multiple parties. A standard is a guideline to be followed when a new design is to be formulated. So the information that's presented in this presentation is based on the current knowledge of the working group members. It will get a little techie at times, but I will walk you through it.
It's okay, the chairlady's very techy.
Smart Grid SP can get a little confusing. For example, not all protocols are standards, and not all standards are protocols. IEC 61850-7-420, IEC 61968, IEC 61970, IEEE 1547. I think you get my point. Some overlap, some compete, some are complementary. Sometimes there are gaps. NIST are actively engaged in identifying SP gaps, harmonization of SP, and the coordination between standards development organizations. According to the history of SP development, usually out of the sea of current SP, a subset take the lead and take full industry adoption. Plus, often there is a race between vendor-developed SP and SDO-developed SP. The working group highlighted multiple SP relevant to New York, and we show just two examples in this slide. On the left, we have EDI, Electronic Data Interchange, which is the computer-to-computer exchange of customer usage and billing information in a standardized format. EDI was developed in New York and nationally, and has gained popularity due to its common, well-structured architecture that ultimately led to a low-cost, secure solution. over on the right, we have DERMS, which is a secure, interoperable platform to monitor and control load and DER. And this is housed at the Con Ed facility. So both of these are great examples of where a good, methodical, standardized architectural approach to complexity can drive true interoperability and commonality between multiple systems and organizations. So, 5 key benefits of a DSPP architecture. 1. An architecture helps to identify gaps in technologies and SP. 2. Drives interoperability. 3. Provides commonality. 4. Can describe DSPP evolution. And 5. Can describe DSPP interactions. The working group reviewed each of the architecture standards shown in this slide. The IET SGAM, shown at the top right, the NIST and SGIP 2.0 bottom right, NIST 3.0 in the middle, which is currently out for approval, the IEEE P2030, which is the top middle, the IntelliGrid 2.0 EPRI to the left, and the GWAC stack to the bottom left. So though each of the architecture standards shown here bring their own strengths, NIST 2.0 and the IEEE P2030 were selected as they are both approved and harmonized American national standards, and were the most practical to use in the time frame we had. We kicked off the development of a DSPP architecture purely to illustrate the benefits, as you will see in the next few slides. However, we would like to emphasize that should New York continue the development of the DSPP architecture, we recommend a thorough review of all available standard architectures to ensure the most appropriate and up-to-date is selected. So as I mentioned, NIST 2.0 was used by the working group. It's useful in identifying DSPP scope. The New York ISO, for example, and likewise the DSPP, can be described by identifying which of the 7 domains shown in clouds they play in. It is through the interfaces between each of these domains, shown in the blue lines, that the DSPP is described, and is where the architecture development is focused on. And it's here that interoperability and standardization really starts. The DSPP interfaces shown here are representative and have yet to be fully defined. Taking the architecture then one level down in detail, the IEEE P2030 architecture focuses on power control, information technology, and communication layers. They are interconnected by data, integration, and security. The DSPP architecture is essentially developed in 3 steps. Number 1, from the identified DSPP functionalities, as described previously, we then generate the major DSPP use cases. A use case is a common technique used to describe a sequence of events, the characteristics, and all of the actors involved. Number 2, map each use case onto the 3 P2030 architecture layers, identifying the domains, entities, and interfaces associated. Number 3, overlay each use case architecture and then combine to create the final DSPP architecture. So the working group obtained formal and legal approval from the IEEE to distribute the P2030 standard and allow us to modify the diagrams for this proceeding. The next slide provides a 1 use case to architecture example.
Perfectly clear.
Of course, the Technology Working Group is mostly comprised of engineers. Hence the passion for schematic diagrams. The 7 NIST 2.0 domains are shown in the large boxes. The entities are the grey boxes, and the lines are the labelled interfaces. This is one DSPP use case to architecture example for dynamic electricity production forecasting that was described earlier on in the presentation. This is used to plan the DER participation in the day-ahead market. This is one of the 3 layers, the IT layer. First of all, we start out with a request for a next day-ahead forecast. This all starts from the distribution management entity. A command is issued to identify which DER is going to participate. The DER entity within the customer domain is highlighted. Next, there is a request to determine the geographic DER location. GIM system highlighted. Then the availability of the DER, the geography, and the weather forecast data are all combined in the distribution management entity. That combined forecast is then issued to the distribution automation entity within the control and operations domain. The DER dispatch is then checked to make sure there are no problems on the grid, thermal, voltage, stability, etc. And that cleared DER forecast is then issued to the market. And the retail market then clears that DER for day-ahead participation. So please note this is an example and is certainly subject to change and is essentially used to illustrate the benefits of architecture development. The communications and power layers were also developed, but they're not shown due to the time constraints. Lastly, the DSPP boundaries can be identified, shown in the red dotted lines. Through the use of NIST 2.0, we were able to map the leading industry SP as applicable to the DSPP. The working group provided a holistic list of SPs that would likely cover the DSPP. And this slide shows the major SP that the working groups identified and mapped them to the NIST 2.0 framework. So, finally, to conclude, our findings are that there are many SP that currently can support DSPP. Interoperability for DSPP has essentially already begun with this working group and should be continued following a structured architecture. And this working group recommends the Commission encourage, support, incentivize interoperability, sustainability and future-proofing to reduce the cost of DSPP implementation and increase utility and customer uptake. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you.
So to make this work, does the Commission have to pick an architecture? And if so, when would it be most beneficial to do so in the process?
By being able to pick an architecture that is part of a standard, in particular a national standard, has, we believe, as a working group, many benefits, and we think should be done for New York to create this DSPP. The question of when is as early as you can. The earlier the better. This is the starting point. And through an architecture, it provides an illustration for people to then discuss, argue, modify, change how this DSPP is really going to work and operate, and who are the players in it. Hope that answers your question.
If we pick an architecture, This is something that always befuddles me. So let's say we pick a particular SP. Is there a threat to us or to the state that if someone comes up with a different requirement, that we're going to have all our utilities and all the vendors change their standard? Maybe it works that way, maybe it doesn't. I'm just curious.
That's a good question. Actually, in our discussion with IEEE in requesting legal permission to access this standard, one thing we're going to provide is feedback to IEEE about what we found with the standard, what problems we identified, what things that we felt didn't fit in necessarily with the DSPP. And so, yes, I think there's the opportunity to provide feedback to the national standard and have modifications made.
So actually, maybe by leading, we can affect the standard as opposed to follow it?
Correct.
And then I have one more question. ADR, automated demand response. Do you see that as a key component of the functionality? And I'll put that to everybody else on the panel. Is that a yes?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. It's one of the functions that we certainly envision.
Yeah. We haven't. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to make one comment on, you had asked about the standards and protocols, the architecture. I think what the utilities presented was that we had already taken some direction on not necessarily a standardization, but an understanding of the standards and architecture that are out there that are viable, that we think that have longevity over time. So we thought that was already started.
And would that architecture or the standardization go down to the building management systems? Or would you expect the interoperability to occur at that level? Is that the way it works?
I think from the architecture perspective, we've shown two levels in this presentation, starting from NIST 2.0 and then taking it one level down to the P2030. In reality, there are going to be multiple levels. We just shown the top two. So I think as you build this out, there is the opportunity to create several sub-levels and increase the detail of architecture. But still, the architectures can roll up, and they all follow the same characteristics, the same descriptions, the same terminology, for example. And that could lead down to eventually
closer to the microphone, please? It's so hard to hear you. 6 inches.
It's a strong Brooklyn accent that we're having trouble with.
So you could envisage that the architecture could lead down all the way to a building management system, potentially. Yes.
Okay. Just.
So if I understand, Mr. Lovelady, you're saying that it's important that the Commission makes a decision to pick an architecture. Is that correct? And the Commission has to make that decision?
No, that's not the case. It's the case that the Commission has to make a policy direction, and that we want, to feel what that policy or those overriding guiding principles are, the interoperability, the commonality, and then the utilities or the DSPPs, the future DSPs, whoever are creating the system, will have to use a standard in order to make that happen. So you don't have to pick a standard. You have to issue your objectives, and then the utilities can go about do that.
Okay, and then who would make the decision on what that is then?
It would be whoever's implementing the DSPP functions.
Okay, but that is a critical piece, though.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we had discussed that in the working groups, that was our recommendation.
So amongst the working group, was there a consensus as to what direction to go to, or was it one that there's a lot of push and pull going on?
In terms of which standard architecture to pick?
Yes.
Yes, there's certainly a lot of push and pull, and there was a lot of debate about that. Hence our suggestion is that this should be fully investigated, and the most appropriate, the most recent and up-to-date should be the standard that's followed for an architecture.
Thank you.
And the intent of the working group was just to give the Commission and to give everybody a flavor of what will have to be done in the future in order to get this vision realized.
So I'm a little confused. I mean, it seems to me that what we should do then is, as Commissioner Berman said, we'll identify what we would want the objectives to be in terms of a standard that's adopted. Would hear back maybe from the utilities as well as others as to what particular protocol seems to best fit our objectives, and then we would want to standardize against that protocol. I mean, at some point it seems we would have to identify, otherwise everybody would interpret it their own way. Is that the way, do you envision it working?
The way I envision it working is you set your objectives, and then the parties, utilities, and other parties determine how best to meet those using standards that are available and the standards that are being developed, and then implement the DSPP using those standards and protocols.
I think that goes to my original comment.
Might not be clear.
How do we achieve the balance between consistency, that we don't end up with 6 different sets of protocols and 6 different architectures? I don't think I'm doing this.
I think it's the point that you don't send each utility off on their own. That you do it in a process where they're communicating and they're with each other and with other stakeholders in order to get the best standard available to meet the
Once
objectives
again, it may not be
overall.
the utilities, it may be an independent DSPP, depending on how that decision goes.
Right, exactly.
A part of that process also is the fact that you might recommend national protocols, a consideration for open protocols. The utilities have existing systems, and some of these are going to be key components of the phasing of a REV process. And some of those protocols will have to stay in place if we want to leverage those assets, and they may be phased in over time. So that flexibility is going to be required as we move forward.
It's clear as mud.
Is this working group continuing to meet now?
No.
Should it?
There's a lot of work to be done. We're only scratching the surface.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next presenter is John Deloy of staff. He'll be presenting for the Platform Technologies subgroup.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Happy to be here this morning to update you on the work of the Platform Technology subgroup. In that regard, I'd first like to again acknowledge the parties and the individuals that have worked very hard and collaboratively on this DSPP platform technology effort. We've had the involvement of some the most wonderful industry minds and workhorses, and it has been exciting to work on. So to start, I think we would all agree that there are many, and what we found is that there are many enabling platform technologies in the marketplace today, and the pace of innovation and capabilities is clearly increasing. ADMS, many of the things that were discussed in the earlier presentations, those technologies are commercially available by firms. They're being worked on as described by Tom and the utilities. So there is certainly fertile ground, and things will continue to advance technologically. And so we believe the situation presents both opportunities and challenges as we're discussing today, and underscores the need for an understanding of technology development that maintains, again, our line of sight back to our policy goals. So, with regard to this subgroup's objectives, when the group formed, it quickly realized that given the complexities of a dynamic world of current and emerging technologies, that a common approach, again, would be needed to assess the available technologies. And in fact, an approach that defines and maps enabling technologies to the required functions is critical, as are assessments of the technology's maturity, which can help identify technology or functional gaps. So what we did is we've developed a matrix mapping tool designed to provide a common approach or understanding to those relationships, again, between the technology readiness, its maturity level, and mapped across the functionalities that are required. So, the technology subgroup built upon the efforts of the other subgroups you just heard from. And in fact, we worked very closely. Many of the members, and Eleanor mentioned this, worked on overlapping teams. It truly became a super collaborative, in fact. And key efforts that the technology subgroup built on were the development of the required functionalities and the recognition and use of the IEEE P2030 standardized architecture as a framework to understand these things. So the subgroup recognized early on that enabling technologies are in a wide range of commercialization or development stages and that a sense of technical maturity is needed. So in this area, we discussed and we decided on using what is a fairly common assessment tool that some of you may have heard about in your past, the Gartner Technology Hype Cycle. It's a 5-stage scale, 1 to 5, that characterizes the maturity, adoption, and social application of technologies, where 1 is considered very early concept stage, characterized by innovation and R&D, early R&D, while 5 is the plateau of productivity. That's their words, Gartner's words, not mine, where technology is very mature, ubiquitous, and widely adopted. In addition to a maturity level, the subgroup also added a dimension to rank at what temporal stage or phase an enabling technology would be needed to be implemented. The group decided on a 3-stage phasing rank, and again, this is rough, obviously. An initial 5-year phase 1 to 5, a phase 2 from years 6 to 10, and then a final phase 3, roughly 10 years and out, just to give a lens or an understanding of where things are at and when they will be needed in terms of functionality. So in the next slide, I'll explain the structure of the mapping matrix tool and how it pulls together these parameters in the useful format and how it will map the enabling technologies to the required functions. And again, just to rehash what David said, us engineers love to get into the weeds on stuff. So this is a screenshot of our mapping tool. Across the top right are the required platform functionalities that you heard described earlier by Forrest, broken down by the grid, customer, and market functions. The technologies, I went too fast. The technologies list column is simply the list of identified enabling technologies. The left column, labeled architecture layers, groups the technologies by those 2030 standard architecture layers you heard about: communications, IT systems, and power systems. The phase column, the DSPP phase column, is the indicator of what phase technology is needed. And again, 1 indicating years 1 through 5, 2, 6 to 10, and 3, 10 years and out. This maturity column rates the technology with the 5-point Gartner Hype Cycle scale. Again, 1 indicating early concept and 5 indicating most mature. And lastly, each technology listed is mapped against each functionality in the right-hand area, noting whether that technology is required for the function or whether there are alternatives available to satisfy a functionality requirement. And again, this is we feel this is a real good framework for understanding the technologies, getting a sense of their maturity, the phase that they'll be needed, and given the functionalities they have to satisfy. But this is very preliminary, and in fact, the group would have to, someone would have to do much more work to flush this out. We really didn't have a lot of time to have extensive discussions, for example, to really get into the fine definitions of the technologies and the mapping. So what you see and what you'll see in your work papers is really a first cut that really needs much more input from all of us. So how can this tool, once properly populated, then assist in our efforts? To understand better, let's look at an example of technology evolution. And again, these concepts are very familiar to all of us. The bullets at the top relate to the arrows going across the middle of the page. And in this case, we're looking at, for example, HVAC monitoring and control. And we'll look how technologies typically mature and are adopted given a DSPP entity and third-party providers for these services. So early on, we see custom solutions, or R&D and innovation stage. Technologies are still being proven. In this phase, there are typically custom HVAC solutions and their demonstration projects offered. By perhaps DSPs and/or third parties. As the technology matures, more demonstrations are completed successfully, early adopters start to jump in, a market develops, and third-party providers will begin to offer premium services. In this example, third-party HVAC services may be provided at this point to high-end residential customers as well as commercial customers, for example. This is followed by a period when products and services become commoditized, with fast-following customers increasing demand for the technology. DSPPs may begin to offer value-added HVAC services to its commercial customers. Third parties may begin or would be pushing the envelope, selling advanced differentiated premium services. Meanwhile, the technologies are maturing more, they're getting more widespread market acceptance. And in the last stage, these technologies become ubiquitous, low-cost, and scalable. In our example, HVAC monitoring and control becomes a low-cost basic service offered by the DSPP, and differentiated and advanced systems of value are offered prominently by the third parties. So, moving on to the key findings. It's clear a number of technologies exist today that can support DSPP functionality. And as you've heard, there are in fact many ongoing efforts by the utilities, original equipment manufacturers, new players in particular that are making great strides in advanced distribution monitoring and control technologies. The flip side of this is that there are no off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all systems right now, which underscores the need for a common approach coupled with the ability to scale up. In fact, DSPP development will necessarily depend on and leverage existing utility distribution systems and capabilities, which are going to be integral to all of these efforts. So to sum up, the Platform Technology Working Group has developed a standard architecture approach and toolkit that can help us wade through the dizzying array of current and emerging technologies. And it is dizzying. By defining mapping in a good way, by defining mapping and understanding these technologies across functions, understanding their maturity, we can identify what technologies are available today, what gaps exist, and better understand what efforts over time will be needed to enable the DSPP platform functionality. That concludes my talk. Thank you, and us will be happy to answer any questions.
Yes.
So you got started on the busy chart. How much more work is there to populate it?
A good amount. I think we need the input certainly of the utilities and their distribution engineering folks, companies like Siemens, Bridge, and others, the Smart Grid Consortium folks. I think we need all the players that can bring their best thinking and expertise to the table. It would take several, and again, we just ran out of time. We were going to plan on some extensively long meetings to hash these things out. When you look through the work papers, you'll see many of the definitions, they're not completed yet. And people started sending in comments and discussing them. We just didn't have time to really flush it out properly. I feel the framework is fantastic, but again, I just think if we had more resources, or as we get more resources and can approach these tasks, it will greatly aid our understanding of how we can roll this stuff out and get from here
and
to there.
I think what you've heard from our working group is it's an evolution, it's a process. We're not going to get there overnight. Give us 6 more weeks maybe, but it'll take some time.
My experience on all of these things and putting in new systems is that you have a starting point where you make a decision of the kind of functionality that you're going to want to need on day one. And then as the market matures or new products get developed or you identify areas of improvement, the technology continues to evolve, and that we've moved away from sort of the waterfall approach of designing systems to meet an end, but more of an agile development so that we're meeting needs as we go forward. And I guess, to me, for us, the issue is not so much as what do we need for the final vision, but what are the critical components that we need to begin? I mean, I think that's, I'm a concern, because, you know, we could design this forever, and by the time we get to our decision, the world will have moved on, so it's an issue of how to start. Do you feel, from that standpoint, based on where you are, and I know that there's more work to be done, that within the next several months we could be in a position that there's comfort onto what are going to be the critical functional components that we'll need for the next at least 2-3 years to get this all going? And I'll put that to the panel on that.
So yeah, from a utility perspective, I think that it's clear that the foundational elements that the chair spoke about earlier have to be decided. And to the extent that our working group and the information we provide and the customer engagement working group, the markets and pricing, combine together to a functional element of what we think is kickoff, then the technology portion can be better defined. And I think that we struggled with, what if you want it all?
You're designing too.
And if you're trying to design it all, yeah, it's very detailed. So I think that's where we could come back into better defining the functionality and then really getting the right people into the room to make those decisions on implementation plans.
Yeah. Anyone else? Jim and Jenny?
Just a quick reaction, listening to the presentations. I think, in my opinion, the Commission needs to focus on what its expectations are regarding the capabilities of the system. Perhaps stay away from specifying architecture, but what are the capabilities realistically that you would expect in, say, Phase 1 or Phase 2 or Phase 3, but at the same time, encouraging these discussions to continue. There's no way the work is done. As Mike said, the surface has just been scratched. And I think the Commission should also set expectations regarding pilots and research and development work, and so forth, so to have this continue.
I'm all reminded a little bit of the joke about the French Revolution, the guillotine, and the engineer, but I'll tell that later.
I would just mention and build on Jim's point, perhaps, and give a comparison to the EDI analogy again. When we did that process back 15 years ago, and Luann can speak to it too, maybe she will later in her remarks, but the Commission really left it to the working groups once it set its expectations on the retail market and the functions it wanted to do. The EDI and the retail access working groups that developed those business processes really worked from the vision of the Commission. The Commission, in that example, did not specify standards at the outset or protocols. It let the working groups decide, work it out, come back. It affirmed them, and work went on from there. But it provided a good model for how things could work. Now, granted, this is much more dynamic. The retail access was a piece of cake compared to this. You're dealing with non-dynamic systems, CIS, consumption history, meter databases. Here we're talking sensitive control telemetry of the distribution systems. But in terms of the model, it was the vision of the Commission that really got it going. And the working groups did the horsepower. They developed the standards, the protocols, the common architecture, the business rules and processes, and it came together. Although this is, again, orders of magnitude more complex.
David Lovelady with a response on the focus of the near term versus the long term, and I agree. Definitely, we need to do both in some respects. We need to be able to look at the long term, albeit at a high level, and then over the next few months, if possible, we need to look at in more detail at the near term, but whilst considering where we want to go. For example, you could build a communications infrastructure that meets the needs in the next 2-3 years, but in your long-term plan, we want to apply additional technologies. So you want to make sure that you do make an investment and build in technology that is sort of future-proof and scalable, considering that long-term view. Thank you.
we're fine. So,
All set?
Yep.
All right, thank you very much. And to wrap everything up is Peggy Neville, staff, also a co-convener for the working group.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Zibelman. Good morning, Commissioners. As you can see, the Platform Technology Working Group covered a tremendous amount of ground in our short time together. To close, I'd like to provide a high-level summary of our approach and key findings. Our working group found that the process we took in some ways was as informative as the content itself. As Michael presented earlier, we were charged with identifying the technology and infrastructure needed to enable the DSPP. In order to answer that question, we needed to start with the overall goals of REV and incorporate input from our working group. In order to identify the needed functionalities of the DSPP. That work allowed us to group the anticipated functionalities into 3 key areas: grid, customer DER microgrids, and the market. Through the lens of the structured architecture that David spoke to earlier, we organized our task by looking at each area from 3 distinct system perspectives: power systems, communications, and information technology. At that point, we were then able to begin identifying specific, tangible technologies. Throughout our working group discussions, and as we've talked about here today, the concept of a staged approach and evolution of the DSPP kept occurring. We believe the technology discussion benefited from an assessment of maturity level. In the next few slides, I will again highlight our key findings. The New York utilities have been planning and deploying technologies that can help achieve the REV objectives. Most importantly, we can build upon the work done here in New York and more broadly in support of rolling out REV. REV provides a context in which to align this ongoing activity with a larger vision for New York. The working group followed a process that had a clear line of sight from one subgroup into the next. Due to the complexities of the REV process and its many moving parts, it is very important to maintain that line of sight between policy goals, functionalities, and the investments that will be needed to support various platform technologies. DSPP 1.0 will look different than, say, DSPP 3.0. As such, the functionalities of the DSPP will naturally evolve and scale, as will the technologies necessary to support it. Standards and protocols can truly support the efforts that REV seeks. A number of well-defined standards and protocols exist that can be called upon. The rigor of a structured architecture can support New York in achieving interoperability and consistency among the DSPPs. Many technologies exist in various stages of maturity to support the DSPP. However, we need to be mindful that there is not one off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all product that will meet all the needs of each DSPP. Each DSPP will need to consider the existing utility distribution systems and capabilities currently in place in determining how it will be implemented and evolve over time. Again, mapping technologies to functions using a common approach can be a useful tool for the DSPP as well as for staff in assessing implementation plans and identifying gaps that may exist. Throughout the work of the subgroups, a few themes emerged that we share with you now. Designing in cybersecurity. This cannot be an afterthought in the world we live in today. Assure interoperability and consistency across DSPPs in order to truly animate the markets in New York. And while there is an interest in moving ahead quickly, we need to be cognizant in this initial phase that we can support future flexibility and scalability. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight the work of the Platform Technology Working Group. As was stated earlier, the full body of work has been filed in the case and has even more detail than we were able to cover today. I, too, would like to thank my fellow co-conveners, subgroup leads, staff team, and the entire working group for a very productive few weeks. And on a personal note, full appreciation for all for bringing this non-engineer along in this topic area. We will now take any additional questions you may have.
Thank you. Could have fooled me, Peggy. But appreciate it, and I think your last comment. I actually think the issue of cybersecurity didn't come up, but obviously was part of your thought process.
It's absolutely embedded in the standards and protocols.
So that's almost a given. Questions, comments? Okay. Well, thank you. You guys did a tremendous job. You certainly, I think, covered the waterfront. What I'm particularly amazed about is how you were able to get these working groups lined up without total confusion about who was doing what. So I think that in itself was tremendous organization, so thank you. And I guess we're on to the next. Do we have a break?
We have a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene at 11:15.
Right. Thank you.